Hello, and welcome to our Luke Bible class. It's time for another study. We're glad that you're tuned in with us watching this video. We are ready today to begin in Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 1. This is class number 22, and I did have someone tell me they appreciated the fact that I had numbered these. It helps them keep track of that, so I'll just keep doing it since it is helpful. So today, we're going to be studying the first 25 verses here of Luke 23. I think we've made this observation before that we're at a part of Jesus' life here, obviously, where, man, the events are just boom, boom, boom. They're just one right after the other. And in one regard, it's difficult to divide that up for study purposes. But on the other hand, it's fairly easy to do so because there are definitely segments of things that are happening, and these segments, if you can call them that, you piece those together and they make this series of events. So we saw Jesus in the upper room and in the garden, and then he is apprehended, he's arrested, and he is taken, and he is put on trial. And that's actually, well, no, that's not where we're starting because we studied that last week. He is taken, and there is a portion of his trial, let's say it that way, a portion of his trial that is the Jewish trial. It's before the Jewish authorities. And we studied that in our last study. Now the trial is going to continue, but there is another part to that trial, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. And then, of course, immediately you're going to go from that into his crucifixion, his death, his burial, the resurrection. So all of those things are just transpiring in pretty quick succession, time-wise. Today, as I said, we're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 23, and the study sheet is available. You can find that online on the Facebook page. I've tried to write some thoughts to introduce our study, and today I talked about some things there that we'll mention during the course of our study, so I don't want to go ahead and go there yet. So we look at Jesus on trial. He's been arrested, he's been taken, and this was at night, we'd say the middle of the night. In the darkness, he is arrested. He's taken to the house of the high priest. Actually, we talked about this. There's two high priests, and he's in both locations, and perhaps those are both in the same kind of a compound area there of Jerusalem. But nevertheless, in the night, some of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, come, and they determine, or they already know that they want Jesus dead. They're not there to try to figure out whether or not he's worthy of such. They already know they want that. And so they just have to find what will pass off as legitimate accusations to make against him with witnesses, to give testimony that he is guilty of such. And so when they are finally satisfied with that, then the next day, so it's the following day, and the council is convened, the Sanhedrin is convened, and Jesus is brought before them. Well, they already have their verdict, they already have their witnesses, they already know what he's going to be accused of, and they charge him with blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God, the Christ. And so for their minds, he is worthy of death. So they believe, and so they want. But they want something. It's not just that. They want him to be able to be accused by the Romans of being worthy of death. And so this is going to have to shift. And the chief priests and the scribes, they escort Jesus from the Sanhedrin, which convened in a facility that was a part of the temple compound. And they're going to take him to the residence of Pilate. And we're going to, and that's going to begin this process of their making accusations before Pilate about Jesus. They're seeking for Roman condemnation of Jesus and Roman sentencing of Jesus to death, specifically by crucifixion. So that's what they're after. So we pick up in verse 1. The whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Well, let's just go ahead and stop right there. Let's first of all think about Pilate. Pilate has the title of governor of Judea. His jurisdiction is Judea. He is the highest ruling Roman official in Judea, and of course that includes Jerusalem. Pilate, like most government authorities, was a ruthless, wicked man. You may remember that back in chapter 13, Pilate is mentioned, the only other time he's mentioned prior to this, when the chapter 13 begins with, "There were some present at that very time who told Jesus, about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices." So there apparently were at some time Galilean Jews who came to Jerusalem to offer worship, to offer sacrifices, and we don't know the story behind it, but Pilate had them killed. Pilate slaughtered them, and as it is expressed here, their blood was mingled with their sacrifices. So he is a ruthless man. It's difficult for us to grasp, I think, just how degraded and how wicked, how immoral, just how awful these government officials could be. I'm not going to say that all of them were that way, but there were those who obviously were. They were terrible people. A good sense of that can be gained. There's a book titled The Killing of Jesus. It's written by Bill O'Reilly, and his introductory chapter, and I'm not remembering now if it's the first chapter or if it's in the introduction to the book, but he paints a picture of what it was like living at that time with the people ruling over you that you had ruling over you, and just how degraded and awful these people were. Those are the kinds of folks that Jesus is being brought before. Pilate is the governor of Judea, and this is the man before whom Jesus stands. And so they make their accusations against Jesus. That's our first question on our study sheet. That number one, he's misleading our nation. Number two, he's forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. And number three, that he himself is Christ, a king. So they added that little part to it, that he is setting himself up as a king. They were trying to find something that they could accuse him of before the Romans, that the Romans could find fault with. And the Romans were huge about everybody behaving, minding their P's and Q's, watching, being careful to observe the law and not causing trouble. And any time that people did do that kind of thing, there was a severe price to be paid for that. And so they hoped that these were the kinds of things that would get Pilate's attention. Now, these are not the things that the Sanhedrin had found Jesus guilty of, or they believe they found him guilty of themselves, because that was not anything that was going to cause the Romans to take action against Jesus. So they had to give these charges, for which there's been no trial or anything in that regard against Jesus. And so that's what they say to Pilate. And Pilate said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." Now, obviously, we have an abbreviated version of what went on between Jesus and Pilate. We've mentioned this before, that Luke's account of these events that we're looking at, have looked at, are looking at, and will look at, tend to be more brief than we find in the other gospel accounts. But this was more than just Pilate asking one question and Jesus responding, and then Pilate saying, there's no problem here with this guy. So there was more to it than that, but he investigated the charges that were being laid against him by the Jews before Jesus. And in that line of questioning, he comes to the conclusion, I find no guilt in this man. You've made these charges, but I find nothing that backs up what you're saying and what you're accusing this man of. But they were urgent, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. He's a troublemaker. He's a troublemaker. He is stirring the people up. He is not contributing to the peace of the empire. Rather, what he is doing is influencing just the opposite. So they're pushing hard. They're pushing hard against Pilate to find reason to condemn Jesus. And Pilate sees what he believes to be an out, because they mentioned that the fact that this has been going on in Galilee as well. Well, Galilee is beyond the jurisdiction of Pilate. And so verse 6 continues then. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, and when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. So this portion of Jesus' trial is going to go from Pilate to Herod, back to Pilate. But this is all considered this part of the Roman trial. Now, Herod, we've heard Herod mentioned several other times in Luke's gospel, and Herod was an awful man. He was a horrible man, and he is mentioned several times in Luke. There is another Herod that is mentioned back in chapter 1 in regard to the birth of Christ and what was getting ready to transpire and all. But that was Herod the Great, the father of this man, Herod, who was tetrarch of Galilee. His jurisdiction was up in Galilee, and there was the place of his residence and the city where his palace, his home, his official home was there, and it was a prominent city, but you don't even find it mentioned in the pages of the New Testament and the Gospels in the life of Christ. But folks knew him, they knew where that was, and they knew what went on there, and it was horrible. He in particular is one that I think is mentioned by name in the book, The Killing of Jesus, and some of the things that transpired there. It's just awful to even think about. You might want to read that, and then again you might not, but it gives you a feel for the circumstances that these people were living in and how difficult that had to be. So Pilate is trying to pass off Jesus. This guy, he really needs to stand before Herod, because he is a man who is from Galilee. He is a Galilean, and therefore he needs to be tried by that man who has authority there. Now, when you go back and you look in Luke's gospel, this is the same Herod. This would be the same Herod that John the Baptist spoke against for having taken his brother's wife. He was the man responsible for the death of John the Baptist. He is a man whose household steward had a wife who was not only a follower of Jesus, but she was financially supporting along with other women. Remember back in Luke chapter 8 and verse 3, these women are mentioned who seemed to travel with Jesus and the apostles, where they went and helped provide financially for the needs of the group. Her name was Joanna. Herod was perplexed because he kept hearing things about Jesus, and he had desired that he might see Jesus. Jesus made no effort to try to have audience with Herod, even though that kind of a step might be something that we would think today would be a good step to take for the furtherance of the cause, so to speak. But Jesus had no interest in doing that. There was the occasion that the Pharisees tried to frighten Jesus by claiming that Herod wanted to kill him, which would have fit in very well with the activities of this man and what people had known him to do and what kind of a person he could be. But Jesus didn't take the bait. He never did take the bait. That was to no avail. But nevertheless, here he is brought before Herod. And Herod, again, is a despicable human being. He just is. He is awful. And yet it's before him that Jesus must stand. So, this is verse 8. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. A man who has attained or achieved the popularity that Jesus had achieved. Not that he was after that, but nevertheless he had achieved it, and people were talking about him everywhere, and people were going en masse out to hear him preach wherever that happened to be, and there were all of these accounts being repeated of how Jesus had healed people. You know, that kind of word gets around, and it made it to Herod, and Herod heard about that, and it's very understandable that Herod was curious. Wow, what kind of guy is this? I would like to meet him and see him and hear him and maybe even see one of these miracles that people are claiming that he's able to perform. So Herod was very interested in seeing Jesus. So, verse 9, he questioned him at some length, but he, Jesus, made no answer. So we know that this interrogation from Herod to Jesus went on for some time. We don't know how long. But we're not, in Luke's account, we're not told at all about the nature of that interrogation. What we are told, though, is Jesus didn't say a word, didn't even open his mouth. So all these questions are being fired at him. There are some questions that just aren't worth answering, and Jesus saw no reason to provide answers for the questions that he was being asked by Herod. And while this is going on, the chief priests and scribes stand nearby, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Now that was right in line with the character of Herod. And as you can imagine, the people that he surrounded himself with. He was not getting the answers that he wanted from Jesus. He was not getting the satisfaction of seeing a miracle. He wanted things just to satisfy his own curiosity, his own interest about Jesus. And he was getting none of that. And so his response was to treat Jesus very contemptuously, which he did. Along with his soldiers, they joined in. And then arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. They were mocking him as one who was accused of being the king, that claimed to be the king. And so again, we think back how Jesus had said in telling about the things that were going to transpire once they got to Jerusalem, that he would be shamefully treated and spit upon. That was back in chapter 18 and verse 32. And that's exactly what's taking place. And so he's been to Pilate, and now he's before Herod. And we're going to find out here from the mouth of Pilate that when Herod sends him back to Pilate, he finds no reason to condemn the man to death. There was nothing there. So Luke gives us this little caveat here in verse 12. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. That kind of relationship was not unusual among these regional leaders of the Roman Empire from Rome. I mean, they saw themselves as in competition with each other to be climbing the place of status. Although to be in Palestine was not status. I mean, that's about as far down, as low as you could get in the Roman governmental structure of things to be a ruler in Palestine, because Palestine was considered just this awful place. It was the backwaters of the empire. Nobody aspired to go there or to live there or to be a ruler there. But if you wanted to be a part of the process of climbing in your prominence in leadership and being a ruler in Rome, then this is where these guys were. And so anyhow, they became friends after this. So Jesus is now back before Pilate again. And he calls the chief priests and the rulers, and he says, "You brought this man to me as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him." So this is the second time Pilate himself has said this man is not guilty. "Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us." So he has been proclaimed not guilty twice already by by Pilate, once by Herod. And he says, look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. That's the verdict. This is really the only trial part of what Jesus is undergoing here, an effort to get at the truth. And what both of these rulers have concluded is that he's not guilty. There is no evidence to back up the charges that you are making against him, that you say he is worthy of death. And so he suggests, okay, I'll punish him. Now, why is he going to punish him? He's not done anything, so you're going to punish a guiltless man. Obviously, Pilate is trying to appease these rulers, but they're not going to be satisfied with anything short of Jesus being dead. And so this was not an acceptable alternative to them. But this is Pilate's first effort to try to do something. Well, actually, it's his second effort. The first one was, I'm going to pass this off to Herod. Now it is, I can't condemn him to death because he's not guilty of that, so I'll punish him, but then I'm going to release him. But then these people all cried out together, "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas, a man who has been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Okay. Now, Luke doesn't tell us what's behind that. We learned this from the other Gospels about a custom that was, I don't know how long lasting it was, but at the time of the Passover, there would be a pardon and release of a criminal. And so, as this is portrayed in the other Gospels, Barabbas is presented to the people that, okay, so here's this guy. And the reason Barabbas is selected is because he is notorious. He is a horrible man. He has done the very thing for which people were condemned to die in the Roman Empire, and that was leading insurrection. They're leading civil unrest aggressively, and that's what Barabbas had been guilty of. And not only that, he's a murderer. So, okay, so you have a choice between this murderer and this Jesus that I can find no guilt in whatsoever. Now, the way Luke presents this to us, they just mention and say, we want, away with this man, away with Jesus, release to us Barabbas. So we have some presupposing done here on the part of Luke as he presents this portion of what's going on. But release to us Barabbas and away with this man. It's just so hard to fathom. It's so hard to fathom that you have these people wanting a man who is obviously and blatantly so bad, and they want to destroy a man who is obviously and blatantly so good. And yet that's exactly what's happening here. Now, I suggest something in the introductory paragraph on our study sheet that we want to be careful not to move too quickly. Obviously, these Jewish authorities are in the wrong. They just are. Horribly in the wrong. And Pilate is going to be complicit with that. Not that he's a good man otherwise, because he's not a good man, and Herod's a horrible man, and all of this, in contrast to that, you have the pure, sinless Son of God. So what I talk about in that introductory paragraph is, we're real quick to jump on board and say, yeah, those folks are wrong, and they should be condemned in what they did, and that is correct. That is correct. But in moving to that point, I think some important questions have to be asked, particularly with these Jewish authorities and rulers. Why and how did they get to a point of actually saying, away with Jesus, give us Barabbas? And that just boggles our mind. When we think about that situation, we have some people who they feel threatened by Jesus. The words of Jesus expose them for who and what they really are, and it's not good. And so in their effort to justify themselves, in their effort to maintain their place and their position and their status and all of those kinds of things, they go to, it's not even appropriate to call them extremes, because it is the extreme of extremes of expressing their preference for Barabbas over Jesus. But you think about this. Next to Barabbas, these people look pretty good, don't they? He's a murderer. He's a leader of insurrection. He is an awful human being. And next to him, we look pretty good. But next to Jesus, we're in trouble. And they didn't like that. It made them very uncomfortable. What I want us to be careful not to do is to be so quick in, taking the moral high ground in condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees and those that were calling for the death of Jesus, because what motivated them were things that sometimes motivate us. Do I ever act in that way as well? Do I ever look for what simply makes my position look better, whatever that is? Or am I really willing to stand in the light of truth and be exposed by it? And quite frankly, oftentimes we're not willing to do that, because that's uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable, and it humbles us greatly. And oftentimes our pride gets the best of us, and we're unwilling to do that. So while we may not do what these people did in respect to Jesus, sometimes we do what these people did. We're motivated by the very same things, and it's not pretty. It just isn't. The question is, will we have the humility, the willingness to say, okay, I'm guilty of this, and I'm not going to make that same mistake. So I just want us to pause here. These men are in the process of carrying out the most heinous thing that's ever been done in killing Jesus. They are. But let's take the time to think about what brought them to this point. And the things that brought them to this point are the very same kinds of things that we ourselves can find ourselves guilty of as well. And let's not forget that. So, Pilate addresses them once more, and desiring to release Jesus, he's still trying. He said to them, still desiring to release Jesus, they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." Okay, so the first time crucifixion is mentioned here in Luke's account. This is the first time crucifixion is mentioned. So why crucifixion? And I got to tell you, I've got to do a little more digging here, because I have heard and I have taught for a long time that the Jews needed the Romans to condemn Jesus because they did not hold the right for capital punishment. They couldn't kill somebody for their crimes, and yet they did. There were times when they took the life of another human being as a punishment for their crime, for the wrong that they have done. They stoned people. Remember when later the Apostle Paul is in the temple and the people are going to seize him and they're going to take him out and they're going to stone him. So why specifically did they want crucifixion to happen here? And I think there's a reason for this. Now, it is true that there were certain things that the Jews and other people over whom Rome ruled could not do, and it was reserved for Roman authority to carry out. That is true, and I'm not denying that at all, and that does come into play here. But I think a better question is, why crucifixion? And I think there's a very good reason for crucifixion, because crucifixion was reserved for the worst of the worst criminals, and they wanted Jesus to be seen in that light. Okay, it's not that we just severely disagree with him. It's not that we theologically disagree with him. It's not just that we think he is on the wrong track here and misleading the people. He is among the most awful human beings there are on the face of the earth, because those are the kinds of people that crucifixion was reserved for. But not only that, crucifixion carried with it a curse. In the old law, cursed is the one who hangs on the tree. Cursed is that person. And they wanted Jesus to be cursed. And they wanted the people to see him as cursed. He is not God's messenger. He is not God's son. He is one who is cursed by God. See, he's crucified. And that's why they were demanding and wanting crucifixion for Jesus. Well, of course, that's exactly God's intention in all of this, wasn't it? That he would take the curse upon himself. And so the awful intentions of these people were playing right into the hands of what God needed to have happen. So a third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no guilt deserving of death." Okay, so 3 times Pilate himself has said not guilty. Once Herod has said not guilty. So I'll punish him and release him. But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate, verse 24, Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. And he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, and he delivered Jesus over to their will. So why would Pilate do what he knew was not the right thing to do? Again, I think it's time to pause. And we can talk about how wrong Pilate was, and he was wrong, and what a wicked man he was, and he was a wicked man. But I think before we get to that point, we need to pause and ask ourselves the question, why do I sometimes do the things that I know are wrong? If we make it through this without some serious self-analysis and asking some very hard questions and shining the very bright light of truth and righteousness into our own lives, it exposes us. And we have to be willing to be exposed. And so we ask the question, why did Pilate do what he knew was not right? And he did. He knew Jesus was not guilty, but he gave in to that. What are the influences in our own lives that might lead us to reach conclusions and take actions that are not right? And I think we would be naive at best, but instead I think we are foolish to think, well, that kind of thing never happens with us. Don't say that. We shouldn't say that. Because we have to recognize we have to recognize in our own lives the very possibility, and I'm not saying this in a condemning fashion, that we are guilty of these things, but we have to recognize in our own lives what we're capable of. And sometimes we are capable of things that we're ashamed of and that should never happen. And that's the beauty of what Jesus is doing here. Is that's the very people he's dying for. So it's a heartbreaking thing to see the way Jesus is being treated. It just tears our heart out. But let's not ever stop looking into the mirror that is God's Word and letting it shape us and form us and bring us nearer and nearer into the likeness of Jesus Christ. We'll pick up our study next time. I was going to say next week. Next time with the actual crucifixion itself. It's intriguing, but it's one of those scenes that you almost hate to look at, but we have to look at it, and we have to appreciate so much what Jesus is doing for us. Well, we'll see you at our next study. Thanks for being with us.